Hi, and welcome to the Frog Pond School of Design, where we try to have a good time talking about things that have something to do with architecture. Before I go any farther, I just want to say if you can think of anything you'd like to hear me talk about, any questions you have, drop a note, and I'll see what I can do to put something together for you. Last time out, we talked about the Eiffel Tower, that big old thing in Paris. So while we're on the subject of Paris, it seemed to make sense to talk a little bit about the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. Of course, it's been in the news a lot recently because of the fire that it suffered. Another reason it's timely right now. 3 years ago this week, the fire that engulfed the whole upper portion of the cathedral took place, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. The cathedral was built between 1160 and 1260 something. So that sounds like it took 100 years to build. There are sources that will say it took 300 years to build. So it probably just depends on what you consider complete. But it's seen a great deal of history in its time. It suffered damage during the French Revolution, during the riots that took place then. People rioted back then too when they didn't like what was going on. The best term for what happened to the cathedral was to say that it was defaced, because literally they knocked the faces off a lot of the statuary, both inside and outside the cathedral. It hosted the coronation of Napoleon I and the beatification of St. Joan of Arc, as well as a lot of notable funerals. The liberation of Paris during World War II was celebrated there as well. One of the most significant events in the history of the cathedral, and this is a little bit surprising that a book would do this, but the publication of the book The Hunchback of Notre Dame had a major impact on the cathedral because it generated a lot of interest and resulted ultimately in a major renovation that was done a few years later. We have to remember this is a church. It is the seat of the Archdiocese of Paris, so it still is a sacred place, although it sees something like 12 million visitors a year. It's considered one of the finest examples of French Gothic architecture, and I have to say the first time I walked in there, I was a little bit surprised that it wasn't taller and more slender and more vertical than it was. It almost struck me as more Romanesque than Gothic, but clearly the pointed arches, the ribbed vaults, all those things, the flying buttresses, everything that speaks to the Gothic is clearly Gothic. And the more I saw some of the other cathedrals that got a lot of attention because of their height and verticality, Chartres, Beauvais, Amiens, some of those, you always come back to Notre Dame and say, this is the real Gothic. This is before they got caught up in who could go the highest and the most vertical. The proportions are gorgeous. It does feel a bit medieval, but that is of its time. Now, an interesting thing too is we think of a timeline. We think of, as years go on, the cathedrals they built got taller and taller. The ones I mentioned, as well as Notre Dame, they were all under construction at pretty much the same time. So I guess the rivalry didn't have a whole lot to do with the timeline. But of course, we get back to the fire. Again, 3 years ago this week, it was engulfed in flames. The whole upper portion, the attic, the roof, came down. A lot of concerns relative to this with the molten lead and concerns on lead poisoning, and then the controversy over how to rebuild it. There was immediately a flood of suggestions of something modern to do there. Now that the old stuff is gone, there were visions of a roof garden, turning the attic space basically into a greenhouse and an arboretum or something, and then how to rebuild the spire. And it was envisioned as being very modern, glass, all this sort of thing. This went on for a while, and finally the agreements have, I think, been made that it's going to be built back as closely as possible to the way it was. This in itself has some controversy because there are people saying, well, that's going to take 2,000 old growth oaks out of our forests, and it's going to put lead back there, and using wood is going to make it susceptible to fire again. These are probably all legitimate arguments, but as they weigh everything, they're now assuring us that it's going to be built back as close as possible to the way it was. Now, the fire concept isn't all that new. The cathedral suffered serious fires in 1194 and again in 1836. So there have been renovations and rebuildings and changes made over time. So whenever you're restoring something, the question is, what date do you go back to determine it? Basically, the fire happened on April 15th in 2019. So the date they've picked, I think, is April 14th of 2019 and go back to there. And I think that's probably going to make the maximum number of people happy with the decision. And it's scheduled to reopen in 2024, which to me sounds a little bit ambitious, since they really are just now to the point of having it stabilized and assessing the damage and what they've got to work with. So I would expect that it's going to take a bit longer than 2 years to have that baby put back together. I mean, it took 100 years to build it in the first place. So that's kind of the story of where we are with Notre Dame Cathedral. And again, along with the Eiffel Tower, those are the two things we think about when we think of the city of Paris and the skyline and what it does. I did mention all those cathedrals that are taller and thinner, maybe not height, but the ultimate in the Gothic Cathedral is probably a very small church, Sainte-Chapelle, which was the king's private chapel, and it's right there just a couple blocks from Notre Dame on the same island with it, but it's the ultimate in minimizing the stone and maximizing the glass, and that's a pretty gorgeous space. So thanks for joining us today at the Frog Pond School of Design. I look forward to seeing you hanging around the pond again real soon.